Greetings, urban farmers, gardeners, and healthy food visionaries. Farmer Greg here, and welcome to the 459th episode of the Urban Farm Podcast, where every day we work together to educate and inspire you to become part of your food revolution. Summer is upon us here in Phoenix, and it's hot. With more people getting skin cancer these days, I'm not willing to take chances with the sun anymore. Before I introduce today's podcast guest, I want to share with you how I stay cool and comfortable working in the summer heat. My number one strategy is wearing lightweight, breezy, sun-protective clothing, like cool, moisture-wicking shirts and hats that shade my head, ears, and the back of my neck. I've partnered with Gemplers.com to handpick my personal favorite sun protective wear, and you can see them at Gemplers.com/urban farm. That's Gemplers, GEMPLERS.com/urban farm. When you use the code URBANFARM01, you get 20% off your first order. Heidi and I use these essential items on this list every day on the Urban Farm. Check them out and stay cool this summer. Superfoods like blueberries, sweet potatoes, turmeric, ginger, garlic, microgreens, and more are so full of nutrients, they are considered to be exceptionally healthy. Growing them is easy if you know what you're doing, and that's why I'm sharing with you the Superfood Garden Summit. In this free online event, you'll glean the secrets of visionary gardening experts and learn their best hacks. Plus, I will be presenting a talk on 3 keys to ultimate fruit tree success. Between presentations, get your questions answered with live Q&As and even win prizes. Did I already mention that this is happening online and it's free, so you can attend from anywhere? Learn more and reserve your spot at urbanfarm.org/superfood. Today on our podcast, we have someone who expects that ruralization is the next evolution. We're talking with Dr. Jason Bradford about rural living as our future. Jason has been affiliated with Post Carbon Institute since 2004, first as a fellow and then as a board member. He graduated from UC Davis with a BS in biology before earning his doctorate from Washington University in St. Louis, where he also taught ecology. He worked for the Center for Conservation and Sustainable Development at the Missouri Botanical Garden, was a visiting scholar at UC Davis, and co-founded the Andes Biodiversity and Ecosystem Research Group. After all that, Jason shifted from academia to learn more about and practice sustainable agriculture. He completed training with Ecology Action in Willits, California, and founded Brookside Farm School. Welcome to the show today, Jason. Are you ready to rock rural living?
I sure am. I was just doing that before our call, actually.
Excellent. We're going to talk about that. So I shared a bit about you. Can you fill in the blanks for us and share more about the path you took to get where you're at today?
Yeah, sure. I guess, what that bio doesn't say is sort of what I discovered along that path that shifted me from this sort of academic trajectory into really working on agriculture and food systems. And that was really my evolving understanding of energy and how our society is organized around energy. And so that came about when I was really looking into climate change issues and impacts on biodiversity through that group you talked about, the Andes Biodiversity and Ecosystem Research Group. When that happened, I really took a turn and decided I was going to try to understand how to grow food and live a life that didn't demand as much energy as sort of the modern world seems to suggest we need.
Oh, yeah, which is quite a lot, especially when it comes to food production. Talk to me about that.
Well, yeah, so the report goes over just basic information related to the evolution of the industrial food system. And, we hear a lot about the wonders of it. And it is pretty amazing when you can get on a tractor and have 400 horsepower controlled by levers, and the amount of people required to grow food nowadays in places like the U.S. is really small relative to the overall population and any kind of historic norms. And so the industrial agriculture system has essentially allowed most people to have jobs that really aren't related to their means of subsistence anymore, aside from having the money to buy things.
Right.
But the trade-off has been we use so much energy to do all this. And it's not just on the farm. Off the farm, even more energy is used when you talk about packaging and processing and refrigeration and transport and warehousing and retail and the refrigerator at home and cooking everything, So when you do all this math, about 10 units of energy go into getting you 1 unit that you actually put in your mouth. And that's completely backwards. No other species would survive that way, but we just happen to hit the fossil fuel lottery and are drawing down those resources and thinking it's normal.
So my jaw dropped just a moment ago when you said that. And I want to repeat it, and I need you to dig a little deeper into it.
Sure.
I think what I just heard you say was that it takes 10 units of energy to make 1 unit of food.
Well, to get it to your mouth. So on the farm level, so this is interesting to break it up, because on the farm level, it's about 2 units of energy to get 1 unit of food harvested. But then what ends up happening, of course, is most people aren't just pulling it off the farm and eating it. The other 8 out of 10 happens after the farm up to your plate. And that's actually fascinating to think about, because we sort of get into these habits where at least I do, I'm guilty too. I like to eat the same stuff over and over again. I know there's a certain amount of variety, but no matter what time of year it is, I could, if I really wanted to, have access to those strawberries or those fresh tomatoes, no matter where I am and what time of year it is, I can go buy that. And so that's what the industrial food system has done, is it sort of has homogenized things, and it's aseasonal in many respects, and it's transporting stuff from all over the world and putting it on display for us. And a lot of what that does is add tremendous energy to the production and distribution of it.
One of the interesting things, I was in a meeting recently, and this is something you hadn't mentioned, and we do a lot with urban agriculture here in Phoenix, and a lot of the plants are watered with processed city water. And I was reminded or educated by someone from Arizona State University that there is a tremendous amount of energy that goes into getting that water from where it starts to drinkable in my faucet. So there's another place where energy goes.
Yes, definitely. Moving water around is usually the highest energy cost, and some of the highest budget items for any municipality is the getting water treated coming in, and then also getting it treated going out. Is the budget of, if you look at the budget of cities, that is one of the biggest, if not usually the biggest set of items. Wow. And the proportion of the electricity that is used in regions is often very high of water, just water movement.
Wow.
Yes.
So in looking at the information that you sent over and what you've already said, you've mentioned something called the report. Now, I'm assuming that's a capital T and a capital R, and I need a little bit more information about what the report is.
I published a report through the Post-Carbon Institute, which is based here in Corvallis, Oregon, and it was released a couple months ago. It's called The Future is Rural, Food System Adaptations to the Great Simplification is the subtitle. And so that's what I'm referring to. And you can get that report at postcarbon.org. Look under publications. There's hard copies available for order too, but you can get the PDF for free.
Oh, nice. So you're serious about this. This is some deep work that you've done.
Yeah, I mean, I really am drawing kind of from a life history that's really unique. And so I had this academic biology background, traveled around the world quite a bit doing research, taught ecology, like you said, and then I switched into doing this sort of small-scale agriculture with a direct relationship to the people I was producing food for, like a CSA program, using mostly hand tools. Then I actually co-founded and worked for 9 years for a company that was doing very large-scale organic conversion properties, integrating livestock, growing a huge diversity of crops. And so, I've worked with processing vegetables and all kinds of grains and other seed crops and legumes, cattle and sheep, permanent crops like grapes and hazelnuts. And so I've seen quite a spectrum. And, I had to do all the relationships with input service providers. Where do you get your fertilizer, and where do you buy your fuel, and how do you lease equipment, and how do you then sell what you're growing at the scale of thousands of acres. And so you combine that life history with my understanding of the energy situation, and just being a human that lives in this society of America, but has traveled around the world and sees how most people live. You just start piecing that together, and I brought to the report kind of the perspective of, okay, let me think, what do I think people need to know who probably aren't super familiar with all this, and how do I present it in a way that that they can relate to, but it's also comprehensive enough so I think they've got enough background to start thinking about how to adapt and change as the world changes around them.
Hence the report.
Yeah.
Awesome. So in the report, so I've got some notes from you, some questions from you. You argue that the trend will reverse from people moving into cities back out to rural areas, because we've seen, over the past 100 years, a mass migration to cities. Why is that going to change?
Yeah, so I think it just follows the energy availability to society. So what I'm basically saying is that we hit the fossil fuel lottery, and that era will start to wane probably in the next decade or two, where the amount of fossil fuels we can extract will become less and less every year. And they are so unique, their properties are so unique, they're so energy dense, they're so versatile, that they've allowed us to build these big cities, to have this globalized economy, to have it in our situation in the United States, and in many countries around the world now, where most people don't really have to work for food or energy. And that if you start to, though, pull fossil fuels out of the system, then the more and more people are going to become jobless or be underemployed. Cities or regions will not be able to afford the upkeep of infrastructure, like all the pumps that have and sewer lines and all this. And you start to just get over time. I'm not saying this happens, from day one to day two. This is sort of a devolution in some respects, which you can see examples of around the world already.
Right.
So, Detroit lost a major industry, and it went from 2 million people to about 600,000 people over some decades, with infrastructure decaying in a downward spiral. So I sort of envision that as we have less energy available to society, that people will start having to fend for themselves more, but more likely in the context of communities reorganizing around natural resource availability and producing more of what they need themselves.
Perhaps call it the 100-year decline?
Yeah, how long is it going to take? Probably 100 years, sure. And like I said, it's probably going to be some places happen faster than others, depending on financial systems and power struggles and access to more local or regional resources. Yeah, it's kind of messy to think about and hard to predict.
And you don't think the whole renewable energy movement will compensate for this eventual decline of fossil fuels?
No, I don't. And so a lot of what I do up front is I explain that, because I think that is a major assumption that people have. A term I've used for this in other contexts is sort of this, well, they'll think of somethingism.
Right. Or technologyism, maybe?
Yeah, or techno-triumphalism. It's this notion that, and so it's really easy to kind of go through some math and get some basic energy literacy. But what's not easy is to cognitively follow through on the implications. So the report tries to do that, and one of the things it points out is, for example, electricity is really a useful, amazing technology, and it's only about 25% of our energy use comes in the form of electricity. And most of the renewable energy technology people have in their heads are really we're replacing one type of electricity generation for the other.
For another. Right.
But it's really, it doesn't help us so much for transportation. We do think it does from the sense of, okay, well, I can see electric vehicles driving around, right? But try putting that on a truck like a heavy equipment truck,
Right.
and your batteries are going to have to be 40,000 pounds, and the truck can only carry 50,000 pounds. These kind of things. So if you look at energy density of batteries, they don't help that much compared to the density of diesel. Same thing applies when you try to swap things out on tractors. I've been running tractor the last few weeks, and it's amazing. I'll go all day, and my fuel tank will cut up by half. I've been on the tractor for like 7 hours, and oh wow, I've only used half the tank. If I were to be dragging steel through rough ground with a battery pack, I would drain it very quickly. So it's not the same thing as driving on a smooth road with good aerodynamics and only really putting your pedal to the metal once in a while. I'm running at 70% capacity most of the time.
So what I hear you saying is that our large equipment is always going to need some kind of gasoline or something that it can burn to make it move.
Yeah, liquid fuels, liquid hydrocarbons. And so that's the key term, liquid hydrocarbons. So we use fossil hydrocarbons. We use gasoline. We use diesel. When airplanes, we use kerosene. These are all just different fractions of the hydrocarbons that get distilled from crude oil. And so you can look at a chart, and I got this in the report, that looks at energy density, and you'll see that olive oil is pretty close to diesel in terms of its density. And so this is where, you can imagine using biofuels.
Yep.
But biofuels compete for other uses.
Right.
We have food, we have fiber. Now you're putting fuel. You're putting you gotta grow the fuel for your farms. That's very different than what we have to do now. And it's also it takes an investment in energy to get that energy back. You've got to basically plant prepare a seed bed, plant your seeds, nurture that plant as it grows, and then you're going to harvest it. All this takes energy. Then you're going to process it. All that takes energy. Then you're going to get fuel back. And what you're counting on is that the fuel you get back is more than what you invested to go in. And with biofuels, you got to be really good to get a positive return. It's not a slam dunk. Things have got to go right.
Well then, wow. What you're telling me then is that biofuels aren't, and I'm going to use a word here, regenerative, and let me explain it a little bit. Mm-hmm. Basically, it costs more energy to make the biofuels, so you don't end up with a positive extra. You end up with less than what you put in.
Well, no, if you do it right, the math can add up, so it adds more. Not for like corn ethanol. That's a joke. But if you grow an oilseed crop and you do a really good job of growing it, and you're in the right soils, they're treated well, and you've got the right climate for it, and you effectively grow and harvest it, then you can get a positive return.
Hold on, you just told me everything has to be perfect.
You got to do a good job. Yeah, so if your yields are only if you farm or garden, whatever, that sometimes my gosh, how come my broccoli just did lousy this year? Mm-hmm. Last year it was rocked. So this is the problem. You've instead of an oil well where it's been down there for millions of years, it's already pretty much in really good condition, and we got to just drill a hole, and it's going to pop out of the earth. And maybe nowadays, of course, we got to go to some extreme lengths with pumping and injecting and off the ocean. But the energy's there, and the relative amount of energy we got to put in to get oil out of the ground is tiny relative to what we have to do to get a return on biofuels.
Right.
And it's much more reliable to go get fossil fuels. Biofuels, you're relying on the right soil, the right weather, the right operators, no pests or, pest control goes well. So I'm just saying the margin. So there's a term called energy return on investment. And for the fossil fuel industry, it was historically like 100 units of energy return for every one we invested.
Oh,
now
wow.
It's down. Now it's down to 10 to 1. Okay, it's dropped as we've gotten down to the dregs, right, with fracking and all this. But 10 to 1 is still way better than what you're going to get from any kind of biofuel scenario. If you do a 5 to 1 with biofuels, you're doing great.
Wow. You worked for the Post Carbon Institute for some period of time, And you've been looking at this whole energy thing, and we got a big dose of it, a couple of minutes ago. Does this breakdown that you're talking about, is this something that'll happen over the course of a year or two, or is this a 50 or 100-year process?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I think it's really hard to say. I think a year is that's too sudden, likely, unless we've got a solar flare that destroys our electric grid or whatever, or something crazy. But I sort of see this as a really linked to also financial and social stability. So the financial system is what's used to make decisions about where an oil well is going to be drilled or where pipelines are going to be put in, right? And we rely then also on these financial metrics of the value of this currency versus that currency, and trade policies that are more or less open or restrictive to determine who gets access to these resources, and with financial investment and stability, also then ultimately whether those resources even get accessed. So you could have war and economic crisis and a lot of lack of trust and confidence between nations that cause a quick downward spiral in our energy extraction and delivery system.
Mm-hmm.
All right? This is sometimes referred to as what's called the Seneca cliff, where there's a fairly rapid evolution of social complexity, and global economic production. Or things, governments step in, nationalize energy extraction and distribution, create rationing systems so that we spread it out and make it more of a fair distribution, and aren't as worried about financial returns on investment, but are really more about let's just get this stuff out into society and do it safely, and let's have more social stability. And then you could see that kind of thing where we'd have a very slow decline in access to fossil energy. Now, from a climate perspective, the best thing maybe to do would be to have a fast unwinding.
Yeah.
But from a social stability perspective, you want it to be slow.
Right.
So we're kind of, I kind of feel like we're between a rock and a hard place.
Why is that?
Well, because basically, if you look at the IPCC reports, they talk about, okay, if we want to keep climate in the potentially safe zone, there's very little carbon budget left, and we should be having our fossil fuel consumption globally, by 2030, and be basically done with fossil fuel use by 2050. That's extremely fast to make that kind of energy transition.
Well, and it may very well happen because we're running low, right?
Yeah, I think that, and that's the thing, is what's going to be, we're not making any preparations though, right? We're not actually paying attention to the IPCC reports and doing anything to try to wean ourselves off this stuff.
What is IPCC?
Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. All right, so the world body that's set up to sort of periodically summarize the state of climate change research and provide that summary plus some recommendations and to policymakers and governments around the world.
Wow. All right. So in this transition, you're calling it ruralization. Are there places that have already started this?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. I wish there was a lot more research on this because, I'm sure historically there's been tons of places where this has happened. Anytime you've had the collapse of complex civilizations, you've had people probably leaving urban centers as modest as they may have been and going back out to the countryside, and you've had then kind of maybe these rural areas not be taxed as much by the central power or worry about getting their sons brought into the army or whatever. So sometimes it's been considered a relief to have the center collapse. This is in the old days when farms weren't completely dependent upon synthetic fertilizers and diesel and global commodity markets for their goods.
Mm-hmm.
But in, probably even in recent times, you can probably listen to people who have fled war or fled areas that have been in economic crisis. So Cuba, for example, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Soviet Union itself, when it broke up, and the Russian population and some of their new satellite states, those people would go out to their dachas and just try to survive. It wasn't a good way to get everybody what they needed anymore. So there's probably lots of examples like that. Greece went through an economic crisis, and people fled Athens and went back to their olive farm.
Mm-hmm. Well, Cuba did a great job of that transition. I don't know how easy or hard it was. I'm not making a judgment about that, but they have an amazing urban and rural growing situation where they're producing a lot of food.
Yes, you may have covered that in other shows.
I haven't yet, but that would be a good thing. If you got any connections for me, I'll take them.
Are you familiar with David Holmgren and his ideas of retro suburbia?
I absolutely don't know David Holmgren. He was basically the co-author of permaculture.
Yeah, I think some of that kind of literature too is interesting, because he's trying to take permaculture and say, okay, we're going to go through this energy descent, is what he calls it.
Mm-hmm.
And permaculture has sort of anticipated this for decades. And here's what you might do to retrofit suburbia. So he's got a really big new book out that has a lot of course, it's a permaculture book, so it's full of diagrams and beautiful pictures.
Gotta love it. Gotta love it. So there's really, from what I hear you saying, there's not really anything that we need to panic about today, but we need to be more cognizant of this.
It's not useful to panic. That's absolutely right. But it's nice to have a sense of urgency so you actually do change behavior, right? So how do you straddle that? Okay, don't panic. You don't want a bunch of cortisol and adrenaline so that you can't sleep and you can't function because you're not in mortal peril right now. But gosh darn it, you and your community could be if we have this unraveling that occurs. And there's a lot of people that are jobless and they can't get access to food and the government's dysfunctional. So I think there are many skills that people can develop now while there's time, while they have the luxury of stability, the courses they can take, practices they can begin. And so that's a lot of what I go through in the report also is sort of thinking about sort of strategy and tactics, about how you would get where you live more ready for this. And I go over sort of the resilience science and what it might teach us about what to do in this moment.
So what does that mean, the resilience science?
Yeah, so resilience science and resilience thinking, it's a branch of ecology that looks at what it takes for, or what happens in natural systems when they go through cycles of sort of growth and an exploitation of resources, and they develop to a point of maturity. And then usually what happens is they get to this point where they start to become fragile. So they go from vigorous young growing things, a community, to a forest that is now old and the trees are toppling over and it's full of disease, and the next windstorm may destroy it. And then what you get this release of nutrients, and now this open space that's not occupied by this old forest. And so they call that the adaptive cycle. And so depending on where you are in that adaptive cycle, you can apply it to social systems. There are things that are maybe useful to think about, to think ahead and prepare. And so what I basically argue in this is that we as a civilization are at kind of the late, what they would call the late conservation phase of the adaptive cycle, and are about to go through a release. And that release or breakdown phase requires that we quickly reorganize to live in a different mode that is more suited to this lower energy situation. That's sort of the broad structure or framework of what we're asked to do now. It's think ahead for when this breakdown phase happens. What would you like to have had ready to go, right?
Right.
Before it happens. What can you put in place now so that you can more quickly reorganize and better feed and shelter and have good, stable social relationships in that process?
Every single thing that I do, the podcast, my online courses,
Yeah.
the local education that I do. We do something here in Phoenix called the Great American Seed Up, where we're basically seeding families with enough seeds for them for their life.
Yeah.
And everything that I do is done because of what you just said.
Oh, that's cool.
I'm
That's
really
really cool,
excited
right?
to go read the report because so much of what you're talking about is it's like the water that I swim in, but I know it's there every day. It's like that's what we need to address.
Yeah. And it's helpful to put it, I think what helped me, so, of course, when you write these things, you're both learning and you're processing it yourself, right?
Yeah.
So it helped me because you can get really frustrated, right? You're an activist, you see these connections and you're worried, and people are living in the moment and they're distracted. When you step back and you look at it from this perspective of resilience science, you go, okay, this is kind of the way these systems are. They get rigid. They lack the ability to change. And so it's very hard to talk to the current system and say, oh, no, you have to change. The system is locked in. It's not going to change until it breaks, unfortunately. It's very hard to reform it, right? How many people just beat their head against the wall trying to reform?
Right.
And it doesn't want to reform. And that's what's really sad, of course. It's sad. But when you get over that and you kind of intellectually sort of see through this lens of resilience science, that's what really helped me. I kind of let go of trying to force, like, listen to me, you must reform.
Right.
And I think more like, okay, what kind of tactics do I need to be ready so when there is a crisis and reform is so obviously necessary, that at least someone has thought ahead has a plan.
Yeah. Well, and everything I've talked about this for years. Everything that I do, I kind of, imagine you're holding your hand out and urban agriculture and growing our own food is sitting in a pile on your hand. And what I do is I show that to people and I say, and you can do this. It's really simple. So rather than trying to get them enrolled in this, this heavy conversation, I just point it, you know what? You can grow your own food and it tastes so much better and you know where it comes from. So that's the way I've chosen to address it.
Yeah, sure. They don't have to understand the big picture necessarily, but you want to try to nudge people to things that will pre-adapt them for a future and make them healthier today.
Right. And as I've often said, it's the business that I have and the data that I share is good now. And when the economy goes down, it's great. I saw that in 2007, 8, 9, and 10, how much more interest there was. People were engaged and playing out more. So gotta love that. I saw one thing in what you were saying a little while ago, and it put this question in my head. And I know this isn't true, but I think a lot of people think this way. And the thing is, but humans have figured out a way to get outside of natural systems. I mean, we're better than natural systems. We can figure out how to do them better.
Right.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, and I think that's, that is sort of that is I think a normal hubris that a lot of us are likely to have. I certainly have had it in the past because things are almost magical right now. The technology we have is so advanced. And I started to think of it like from my own perspective, like I'm specialized in certain ways. I'm kind of a generalist, but there are certain things I'm specialized in that I know so much about that it's almost impossible for me to talk to or explain these particular things to anybody else except for another handful of people. And, so what's happened is that we're just bedazzled. Now, there's somebody out there that knows this much, but we just sort of assume that somebody will figure something out, then we'll be innovative enough. But what's interesting is that the particular stuff that people think about, the technologies, they're so energy dependent. It's like a house of cards that once you see things through this energy lens and you remove the energy blindness from you, you realize like, oh, So like one of my pet peeves right now is like the Internet of Things and like 5G wireless technology. That is so energy demanding. The simple models of like how much more electricity we're going to need if every single gadget is suddenly linked to the Internet, and how 5G wireless technology is so inefficient in terms of traveling through space. It carries more information, but it means you got to put up a relay station, every few hundred feet.
Oh my gosh.
It's just nuts. So, there's all this glorification of the technology, and if you think that we have an infinite supply of energy and we're going to be mining asteroids and, creating some Dyson sphere civilization, maybe, but I really kind of doubt that. So yeah, it's kind of sad, but I understand it. I grew up watching Star Trek, and I love sci-fi. I grew up with these computers that just kept getting better and better. But once I had an energy lens, that I now suddenly became aware of how fragile that all is, and what I want though, like, people are ingenious. Have you traveled to other countries where people are pretty poor?
Oh yes.
You're like, well, that's ingenious, but they're doing something ingenious that isn't some techno glory. It's simple. They're really simple. They're clever, and often it's biologically based.
Imagine that.
Yeah, and that's the kind of ingenuity. Have you ever read that book, Farmers of 40 Centuries?
No.
By King? He goes to Japan and China in early 20th century, like 1906 or whatever. And his descriptions of how they lived is absolutely stunning. And you're just so impressed with the ingenuity. And it was basically a Farmers of 40 Centuries. Like, he came from the U.S. where we were destroying our soils. The U.S. farmers have been horrible for generation after generation. We were never good. We just we have all this land, and we just keep moving to new land and colonizing it and really destroying it. We got rescued by fossil fuels to make all these synthetic fertilizers. But this is really before, all that was available. He says, oh my gosh, he's a soil scientist. I got to go where they figured this out and see if I can bring that back and change policy in the U.S. so that we don't starve ourselves and destroy our soil. And it's amazing.
Wow.
It's amazing what they did and how good they were, And so some of those cultures are still around, and those people, some of those ways of life are still there. Mm-hmm. I think we can learn a lot from them.
Oh, yes. So what can people do to prepare for this future that you envision?
Yeah, a lot of what I think about is I'm not one to prescribe to people like, oh, here's the list. It's more become energy literate, understand your surroundings, understand where you live and what its capabilities are, its history. Find like-minded people that you can collaborate with and start coming up with some kind of strategy and tactics that make sense in your area. And what role you take is going to be very personal, based upon your talents, your interests, your connections, your stage in life. And so that, some of it could be the personal of, learn how to put in a garden. But a lot of it might be related more to how do you get policy in your town ready? Or, how do you get local farmers to make a shift, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So you started the Brookside Farm School. Tell me about it.
Oh, that was interesting. I just happened to be walking my kids. I lived just a couple blocks from the elementary school my kids were going to in Willits, California. And there was this 1 acre in the back where there were some temporary buildings were put up, and so the yard duties couldn't really see kids back behind those. Mm-hmm. So they said you can't go over there to the west. And I learned this, and then I talked to the principal, Chuck, and I said, "You want me to put in a school farm here?" And he said, "Yeah, that would be really interesting." And so, I had to go by the school board, and I had to get approval, and I had to raise some money and get a local nonprofit to sponsor it. But I was training with John Jevons and his group, Ecology Action,
mm-hmm. We've
up
had
in
him
Willits.
on the show.
Yeah, and so I was thinking, okay, well, I'll just start applying this, here. And so I ran that for a few years and transitioned out and brought someone else on who was really good and honestly more experienced and better at it than I am. And then moved to Corvallis. But it was a great experience. There's a lot that you, when you really start having to do it for real, you get humbled quickly.
Oh, yeah. You mentioned John Jevons. We actually had him on the podcast for episode 423 and 424. It was so cool. I was a little bit starstruck because I've known of him for decades.
Yeah.
And so, when I had him on, I just started recording and he just wanted to talk. So I just let him talk and talk and talk. So we actually got 2 episodes right. 423 and 424.
I'm just sort of struck by the number of episodes you've had. What are we up to now?
You're probably going to be pretty close to 470.
Okay, so it wasn't too long ago you had them on.
Right. Yeah, well, about 6 months ago. We do, I guess we're doing about 104 episodes a year right now. So
very impressive.
Well, thank you. I'll take it. So I'm going to shift on you, and I'd like for you to talk about a time you failed, how you overcame that failure, and what you might have learned from it.
Well, very interesting. There was an organization I was part of where I failed, I think, in really understanding that not everyone was on the same page. Not everyone had the same goals. We weren't really a cohesive team. And I made assumptions about it that then led to, I think, it not going so well.
Yeah.
And I don't want to give any details about beyond that, but I think that really struck me as, like, looking back, why things, some of the reasons, not all, but some of the reasons why things didn't work out so well. So that was definitely a maturing experience.
Mm-hmm. What was your lesson from that?
I think it's really important to make sure that people that you're working with understand each other, like working very hard at communication. And if you don't, something's got to give. If people aren't willing to go along with what the group, vision, goals, values, direction are, then, I think the team has to lose people and has to find the right mix.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important.
Big time. Well, and my lesson, because I had something similar happen, I started a nonprofit and it didn't work out so well. And one of my learnings and one of my solutions was I went off on my own, and I pretty much do entrepreneurial stuff. I like to make sure that I have the control direction of the projects that I'm working on. And the ones that I'm starting that I don't have control direction, I have to put them out there and just let them go.
Yeah, so you got to decide, like, okay, well, I'm just going to leave it. If I don't have control of this, I also then have to not be, tied to it and see. Yeah, totally.
So what do you consider your biggest success?
I guess one of the things that that is interesting is this group we talked about, the Andes Biodiversity Ecosystem Research Group. I helped found that, and I was pretty young at the time. I think that is still going, and it's been very, very productive. And as an academic kind of research enterprise, I didn't even stick around for more than 3 years. But I got a really good team together. Mm-hmm. And I think I had this youthful energy and clearly said, here's what I want, here's what and let people talk, but we got to a shared vision, and I helped guide that. And so I think that's been a great project that I kind of wish I could still be a part of, but my life took a different turn. I went into farming.
Nice.
But I think, what's interesting is I look back on why that worked and then why other things haven't, and I think a lot of it has to come down to, do you get the right people together, pulling together?
Yeah. And what drives you?
Well, hunger, thirst, fatigue are all very important, but that's not very visionary or interesting. So I think, I live in a really beautiful place, and I've been around the world, and there have been so many moments where I've just been awestruck by how beautiful something is, or I'm just astounded by natural beauty, and have always really wanted to understand it, appreciate it, protect it. And so I think, I've had a lot of moments in life like that, and I probably do many times. And I'm not a religious person, but I think it's akin to how many people maybe feel like these religious experiences. Mm-hmm. I can just stand and look at the sky and just be astonished sometimes, or the stars, or a flower opening up. So I think that's what I think about a lot, is when I think about the state of the world right now and it really scares me. I'm also motivated to try to surround myself with as much of that beauty as I can and realize that, I like to protect it. I'd like to keep the evolution of life going, in its diversity and wonder.
Wow, cool. And if you could recommend one book for our listeners, what would it be and why?
Well, I am reading a book now, so that's an easy one. It's called Any Way You Slice It by Stan Cox. And the picture has a piece of pie on it, but the topic is not a topic that people like to hear much about, but I think it's a crucial one. It's about rationing and the history of rationing and where it's worked and where it's not worked and why. And I think that's something we're going to, if getting back to what we talked about this energy descent scenario, and I think that we are going to have to face the prospect of rationing of key, goods and services.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that, and I've said this many times, one of the things that I believe is that this whole notion of lack lives only one place on the planet, and that's between our ears. Because when I look at the amount of peaches that I'm harvesting this week off of one tree, it's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So I've always liked the idea of planting our gardens and having that abundance show up. And that's really the drive behind me getting everybody growing their own food, because that's part of the solution. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. If we can take the creative energy of people and disperse that, that love for what they're doing and guide it towards, food production, that's going to take a lot of pressure off of all these resources that I'm so concerned about, and which we're going after in really, dangerous, destructive ways that's undermining the viability of ecosystems all around the planet. That's kind of why I made that switch, into looking at food. Is a lot of the environmental problems we have are by this food system that's pretty nutty.
Oh yeah, isn't that the case? So what one final piece of advice do you have for our listeners?
It's interesting because, a lot of times, you should learn to do this, or I don't. It's not like a technical thing. I think about this. It's just relating to other people well. It's learning how to deal with difficult people, and it might include working with them, or it might include saying, I really can't work with you. Knowing when to make that kind of call. But really getting, how do you get groups of like-minded people to work together for a shared purpose? Developing those kind of skills, practicing that, I think is really critical, and is going to be more and more critical going forward. Having the ability to have, generate trust among people that have this shared vision, I think is really important, and get them to work together and stay together.
Wow, cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show today, Jason.
It's been great, Greg. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's been great having you. I've learned a lot, and this is the level of conversation. When I was getting my master's degree at ASU about 15 years ago, this was the level of conversation that I loved.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you for that. So how can our listeners get a hold of you?
www.postcarbon.org. And, there's a contact form, and they forward everything to me, no problem.
Perfect. And the report, remind everybody where they can find this report that we're going to want to go.
Yeah, the same URL, postcarbon.org, and you'll see at the top, publications. So that it's under, books and reports. It's right there, free to download as a PDF, and you just got to, sign a little form, and then it will send a link to you for the PDF download. It's quite large. It's about a 100-page report. So if people really prefer, they can order it also as a hard copy.
Perfect. And what is the report called?
The future is rural food system adaptations to the Great Simplification.
Awesome. Thank you. And you can find show notes from today's podcast at urbanfarm.org/the report. We are your urban farming resource. You can find us on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and everywhere podcasts are found. Also visit urbanfarm.org to find articles, webinars, courses, and more. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us on the Urban Farm Podcast. Superfoods like blueberries, sweet potatoes, turmeric, ginger, garlic, microgreens, and more are so full of nutrients, they are considered to be exceptionally healthy. Growing them is easy if you know what you're doing, and that's why I'm sharing with you the Superfood Gardens Summit. In this free online event, you'll glean the secrets of visionary gardening experts and learn their best hacks. Plus, I will be presenting a talk on 3 keys to ultimate fruit tree success. Between presentations, get your questions answered with live Q&As and even win prizes. Did I already mention that this is happening online and it's free? So you can attend from anywhere. Learn more and reserve your spot at urbanfarm.org/superfood.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.